Before Gilgamesh became the man who searched for eternal life, he was a king who understood something simpler and more devastating, that death makes everything urgent. In the previous video, you met Gilgamesh through the eyes of the scholars who rediscovered him in the 19th century, through George Smith's astonishment, through the Victorian sensation of a flood older than Noah. Today, you go further back. This is where the story begins. The Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh are the oldest layer of the tradition, composed around 2100 BCE, during a period when the city of Ur was the dominant power in Mesopotamia. They are not yet a unified epic. They are 5 separate poems, each telling a different episode from the life of the king of Uruk. And in them, already, you hear the voice that will run through the entire tradition, a man who knows he is going to die and refuses to treat that fact as something neutral. These texts were written down while the Egyptian pyramids at Giza were still less than 500 years old, while the Trojan War, if it happened at all, was still more than 800 years in the future, while the Hebrew Bible had not yet been composed. They are the oldest literary texts in which a human being looks at death and says, "This is not acceptable," and he will do something about it. Here is what you need to know about these poems and how they came to survive. The Sumerian language is one of the oldest written languages in human history. It is a language isolate, meaning it has no known relatives, no linguistic family to which it belongs. It was spoken in southern Mesopotamia from at least the 4th millennium BCE and gradually gave way to Akkadian, the Semitic language of ancient Babylon and Assyria during the 2nd millennium. By around 2000 BCE, Sumerian was already becoming a learned language, a language of temples and schools rather than of everyday life. Rather like Latin in medieval Europe, which remained the language of scholars and the church for centuries after it had ceased to be anyone's mother tongue. The poems were composed during a period of Sumerian cultural florescence known as the Ur-3 period, roughly 2112 to 2004 BCE, when the city of Ur was the center of a sophisticated bureaucratic empire. But the physical copies that survive today mostly date from the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 to 1700 BCE, when they were copied out by students in the Scribal schools, the Eduba, a Sumerian word meaning tablet house, as exercises in writing and literature. Consider that for a moment. The poems about Gilgamesh were used in ancient Mesopotamia the way Latin texts were used in medieval European schools as canonical texts, studied not only for their content, but as models of literary excellence. They were curriculum. They were what an educated person in Babylonian civilization was expected to know, the way a school child in medieval Europe was expected to know Virgil or Cicero. The American scholar Samuel Noah Kramer of the University of Pennsylvania, whose 1963 study, The Sumerians, remains a foundational text in the field, spent decades translating and interpreting Sumerian literature. He identified in these texts something he called the first literary treatment of existential anguish before death. Not the first myth, not the first religious text, the first time a writer, a human being sitting in front of a piece of clay with a reed stylus, gave literary form to the terror of dying and the desire to transcend it. There are 5 Gilgamesh poems in Sumerian. Each deserves attention, because in each, a different dimension of the problem of mortality appears. The first poem, Gilgamesh and Agga of Kish, is the shortest of the five and the most politically grounded. It is the only Gilgamesh text that reads something like a historical document. The story is simple. Agga, king of the city of Kish, a rival Sumerian city-state located north of Uruk along the Euphrates, sends messengers to Uruk with an ultimatum: submit to Kish's authority or face war. Gilgamesh convenes two councils. First, the Council of Elders, who counsels submission. Then, the Assembly of Young Warriors, who support resistance. Gilgamesh chooses resistance. But here is where the poem becomes interesting. When Agga's forces arrive and besiege Uruk, Gilgamesh remembers something. Agga, during an earlier period of conflict, had once released him from captivity. There is a debt of gratitude, and Gilgamesh, rather than pressing his military advantage, chooses to honor that debt. He acknowledges Agga publicly, praises him, and the siege is lifted, not through victory in battle, but through the exercise of magnanimity. What kind of immortality does this poem propose? A specifically moral one. Gilgamesh's name survives not because he fought and won, but because he demonstrated a quality of character that transcended the transaction of warfare. He was greater than the situation required, and that greatness, that surplus of humanity, is what the poem preserves. This logic will feel very familiar. From Andrew Carnegie to Bill Gates to Warren Buffett, the American philanthropic tradition rests on exactly this idea, that a person can build their immortality not only through what they accumulate, but through what they give away and how. The name on the library, the name on the hospital wing, the name on the university building, these are the walls of Uruk, built not from fired brick, but from the surplus of moral ambition. The poem understands, with great economy, that the deepest form of competitive advantage is the demonstration of virtues your competitor cannot afford to match. The second poem is where things become urgent in a way that feels shockingly modern. Gilgamesh and the Land of the Living opens not with a battle or a council, but with a monologue, and it is one of the most remarkable pieces of writing in the oldest layer of human literature. Gilgamesh says, "Since it is not my fate to be like the men who have died and left their names, I will establish my name there where the names of heroes have been proclaimed." Pause on that. He is not yet grieving a specific person. He has not yet lost Enkidu. The anguish here is categorical, abstract, entirely existential. It is the awareness, not triggered by any particular loss, but simply by having thought clearly about the situation, that he is going to die, and that unless he does something extraordinary, his death will be like all other deaths, unremarkable. And his response is not philosophical acceptance. It is not the advice Cedar will give him centuries later. His response is he will go somewhere dangerous and do something impossible. Because if he survives, his name will be known. And if he dies in the attempt, his name will be known in a different way. Either outcome produces the one thing that resists death, the permanence of one's name in the memory of others. This is the logic of fame as substitute immortality. It is 4,000 years old. It drives every entrepreneur who takes a risk that could destroy them, every artist who stakes everything on a single work, every soldier who volunteers for a mission with poor odds. The calculation is the same as Gilgamesh's. The risk of death is acceptable if the alternative is anonymous survival. The expedition to the Cedar forest, where the guardian Huwawa, the protector appointed by the god Enlil, the Sumerian deity of wind and earth, is the vehicle for this calculation. Gilgamesh wants the cedars. He wants to fell the great trees and bring them back to Uruk. But more than the trees, he wants the story of having faced Huwawa. The heroic action is, at its core, a narrative strategy. He is writing his own immortality in advance. What happens in the poem is morally complex in a way that the text does not try to resolve. Huwawa, captured, begs for mercy. Gilgamesh is moved and considers granting it. But Enkidu, here already present as Gilgamesh's companion, his other self, insists on the killing. Huwawa is decapitated. The cedars are felled. The poem leaves open the question of whether this was right. Fame was gained, but at the cost of refusing clemency to a being who had asked for it. The text does not celebrate the killing. It records it with its moral weight intact. This ambiguity is one of the poem's great strengths, because the pursuit of immortality through heroic action always involves this kind of calculation. What am I willing to do, and to whom, in order to make my name last? The history of American enterprise, from the railroads built on the backs of Chinese immigrant laborers to the tech platforms that monetized human attention without consent, contains this same calculation, made at different scales and with different consequences. The poem does not moralize, it observes. The poem Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld gives something extraordinary, the oldest literary description of life after death that survived. The setup is almost comically domestic. Inanna, the Sumerian goddess of love and war, tutelary deity of Uruk, has found a tree washed up on the banks of the Euphrates. She plants it in her sacred garden, hoping to use its wood to make a bed and a throne. But 3 creatures make the tree her home: a serpent at its roots, the great storm bird Anzu in its trunk, and the demoness Lilitu in its branches. Gilgamesh drives them out and fells the tree. As a reward, he gives him 2 mysterious objects, the puku and the miku, whose exact identity scholars still debate, but which are probably some kind of drum and drumstick, or ball and mallet. These objects fall through a fissure in the ground into the Netherworld. Enkidu offers to go down and retrieve them. But Enkidu breaks all the rules of correct behavior in the realm of the dead. He wears clean clothes when he should be in mourning. He makes noise, he attracts attention, and he is retained in the underworld as a shade. Gilgamesh appeals to the gods. They arrange for a small hole to be opened in the earth, through which Enkidu's shade can speak. And then Enkidu answers Gilgamesh's questions about what the underworld is like. The description is stark and sociological. The conditions of the dead, Enkidu explains, vary according to how many sons a person had, how they died, and whether they received proper burial. A man who had 1 son grieves beside a single brick. A man who had 2 sons sits on a seat and eats bread. A man with 7 sons is like a companion of the gods, sitting on a throne and hearing music. A man who has no burial wanders restlessly without peace. This is the archaic form of immortality, biological continuity through descent, ritual memory through offering, and proper burial as the precondition of peaceful death. It is the immortality of the ancestor, preserved in the memory of those who come after, maintained through ritual practice, dependent on the continuity of the family line. Contemporary American culture is, among other things, a culture that has systematically dismantled these traditional forms of immortality: the extended family, the ritual of burial, the transmission of memory through community practices, and proposed digital and technological alternatives in their place. The Sumerian poem understood the stakes with complete clarity 4,000 years ago. The 5th poem, The Death of Gilgamesh, is the most directly relevant of the Sumerian texts to the central theme of this series. Its subject is simple: Gilgamesh is going to die, and the poem confronts this fact without flinching. While sleeping, Gilgamesh receives a dream in which Enlil, the god of wind and earth, sovereign of the terrestrial gods, communicates to him his mortal destiny. The divine speech has survived in fragmentary form, but its core has been reconstructed by Andrew George of SOAS, University of London, whose 2003 critical edition of the Epic of Gilgamesh is the definitive scholarly text on the subject. The god says, in essence, "Gilgamesh, why do you weep? The fate decreed by Enlil, which cannot be changed, is set upon you. When the gods created mankind, they set death for mankind and retained life in their own hands. You were granted kingship. The eternal decree was not granted to you. Mortality is not a punishment. It is not the result of a transgression. It is not a mistake. It is the ontological structure of the human condition as such. The gods kept life for themselves. They gave humans something else: time. And what you do with your time is what you are." The poem concludes, in the scholarly reconstruction, with a celebration of Gilgamesh's works: the walls, the temples, the gardens, the wisdom brought back from the far reaches of the world. The poem's logic is, Gilgamesh died as a man, but he lives on as his work. Not the biological immortality denied by the gods, not the personal survival of his consciousness or his soul, but the cultural immortality of what he built and what he thought and what he left behind. This is the answer the Sumerian tradition proposes to the problem of death. And it is an answer that American culture has elaborated with extraordinary energy and ambition over the last 2 centuries. From Emerson's idea of the great man whose spirit enlarges his era, to the tech entrepreneur's conviction that a great product can reshape the world and outlive its creator. But notice what the answer does not include. It does not include the literal defeat of biological death. It does not include the hope that technology will solve the problem that Enlil refused to solve. The Sumerian answer is the answer of acceptance. Build well, leave something worthy of having lived. In the next video, you will watch that answer being challenged. The old Babylonian version of the epic introduces something that changes everything: the death of a friend. And grief, it turns out, is not a condition that accepts the counsel of acceptance. 5 poems,
5 different answers to the same question, and none of them final. In the next video, everything changes because something happens to Gilgamesh that no philosophical position can prepare you for. Enkidu dies, and grief, it turns out, is not a condition that responds to abstract arguments. Before you go, the question the Sumerian poems put to you is this: if you knew your name would be forgotten within a century of your death, would that change how you lived? Leave your answer in the comments. The responses to that question across this series have been some of the most honest things people have written in public. Subscribe if you want to follow the argument to its end, and share this video with someone who believes that ancient history has nothing to say to the present. It does. It always has. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next ones. And let me know in the comments what you think. It helps me figure out what to cover next.